Hi, this is Chris German, and in preparation for our upcoming Apartment Owners Educational Webinar, I thought I'd take one question right off the top, and that is, how is the apartment market doing today in terms of values? So we're going to go through some real analytics, and we're going to take a look at it from the position of pre-COVID pricing, pricing during COVID, or say March of 2020 to the end of 2020, and then post-COVID, right? So this year, how are values doing today, and see if that can tell us anything about the direction of values, the overall health of the market. So let's dive in. First, we have the East Los Angeles corridor. So if you're familiar with our work, you know that my team and I sell or represent landlords in the major corridors between as far west as the 710 freeway, as far north as the 210 freeway, as far south as the 91 freeway, and then as far east as the 215 freeway. So we cover two counties, both LA and San Bernardino County. And within that big chunk of the map, we break it down into individual corridors. So the first corridor is the East Los Angeles corridor, which also encompasses El Sereno. So if you take a look at pre-COVID pricing, this building here in El Sereno sold for $286,000 per unit. During COVID, this particular property sold for $300,000 per unit. And then post-COVID, the same building ends up selling for $326,000, right? So we saw an upward trajectory in that corridor, or since 2019, an upward trajectory in terms of values. Now the 710-91 corridor. So this is going to be Cudahy, Maywood, Bell Gardens, Downey, essentially that neck of the woods. Pre-COVID, we take a look at this building here in Cudahy, sells for $262,000 per unit. Then during COVID, a different property in the city of Bell Gardens, same corridor though, sells for $300,000 per unit. And then post-COVID, Bell Gardens again, we have a building that sells for $276,000. Now I would make the argument here that in the 710-91 corridor, prices have not dropped by any significant amount. They're basically bumping along the same values we've seen over the last couple of years. Pasadena, which encompasses Pasadena, South Pasadena, Altadena, that area. We have a building pre-COVID in Pasadena, sells for $603,000 per unit. During COVID, a building sells for $437,000 per unit. Post-COVID, we have a building that sells for $500,000 per unit. Now, one thing I will say here about Pasadena is starting at about the beginning of 2019, prices began to decline, cap rates began to increase. But since about the end of 2020, we've seen now the reverse, where prices are aggressively growing in a positive direction, and we see a compression on cap rates. West San Gabriel Valley. Now this is going to consist of Rosemead, Temple City, San Gabriel, Arcadia. Pre-COVID, we had a building in Arcadia sell for $462,000 per unit. During COVID, we have a building in Temple City sell for an impressive $569,000 per unit. And then post-COVID here recently, we had a building in Arcadia sell for $530,000 per unit. Needless to say, prices are very, very aggressive in this particular corridor. Now the 605 corridor, which consists of Montebello, Whittier, Pico Rivera, Norwalk, again, up and down the 605 freeway. Pre-COVID, we had a building in Whittier sell for $354,000 per unit. During COVID, we had a building sell in Whittier for $345,000 per unit. And post-COVID, here recently, we had a building sell in Whittier for $483,000 per unit. Now, I think I can make the argument that this building that just recently sold in Whittier for $483,000 per unit is definitely an outlier, a different type of sale, if you will. That's not your average price in the area. But what do we know about the corridor? It's performing very well during and post-COVID. The Eastern San Gabriel Valley spans anywhere between Monrovia, Glendora, Azusa, down south to Baldwin Park, El Monte, Covina, West Covina. That's what we consider the Eastern San Gabriel Valley. Prior to COVID, I sold this property for a client of mine in Monrovia for $375,000 per unit. During COVID, I sold a building for a client, different building, also for $375,000 per unit. And then post-COVID, we have a building here in Azusa that impressively sold for $391,000 per unit. So what can we say about the Eastern San Gabriel Valley? That the values are unchanged and strong within this location. The Inland Empire West. Now this is going to basically be between the 57 freeway and the 15 freeway, or Ontario, Pomona, Montclair, Claremont, Upland, those cities, Rancho Cucamonga. So in the Inland Empire West, we had a building in the city of Rancho Cucamonga, sold for $268,000 per unit. We then, during COVID, had a property in Ontario, and I actually was the owner of that property. If you've seen any of our rehab videos, I walked you through this project extensively, sharing with you what it was that we rehabbed on the property, the value that we obtained in terms of the final rental rates. And at any rate, that property during COVID sold for $280,000 per unit, still the highest price per unit that we've sold, or we have seen, I should say, in Ontario sell for multifamily. And post-COVID, we have a building that sells in the city of Upland for $243,000 per unit. The Inland Empire West is doing very, very well in terms of values. The Inland Empire East, so Fontana, Colton, Bloomington, these areas. We had a building prior to COVID in the city of Fontana sell for $236,000 per unit. We had a building during COVID in Bloomington sell for $209,000 per unit. So you got to be impressed when things in Bloomington are selling for over $200,000 a door. That tells you that the market's alive and well. And then post-COVID, we have a property that sells in Fontana for $210,000 per unit. So again, across the board, essentially the last couple of years here, everything's selling north of $200,000 per unit. Inland Empire East is doing very well. So what we know about the market in general is that for the last couple of years, some markets, properties actually have increased slightly, not gangbusters, but slightly. Other areas, values have been bumping along, but trending about the same the last couple of years. And we haven't seen any corridor where values have slipped anything meaningful. Primarily because your interest rates are still very low, so buyers can borrow money very cheaply. So buyers are interested in property. Number two, with all the talk of inflation, right, you want to hedge your bet, take your cash, put it in tangible assets. So there's an appetite for multifamily. And probably the strongest influencer of value is rental rates. Rental rates from the beginning of COVID have done nothing but gone up in all these various corridors. So I understand many of you may find that interesting, that the results aren't something different, having gone through this global pandemic. And I hear you, and I know emotionally why we might feel that way. But if we stick to the facts, if we stick to the analytics, at worst, values are about the same as they were prior to COVID. And at best, we have actually inched up in many of these corridors. Keep in mind, at our upcoming webinar, we're going to dive into much deeper topics, such as what's all the talk about inflation? How does that impact landlords? The eviction moratorium, it expired. Not really. Well, what does that mean? What are the new rules of evictions? What do you do with tenants who didn't pay beginning of 2020, middle of 2020, here just last month? They're all different time periods. What do you do as a landlord? And what's the overall trajectory of the market? We look to address these questions and those questions that you as a viewer have submitted as you register for the event. Be sure to click the link below, click somewhere here on the landing page as you see, and we look forward to having you as a viewer of the webinar here shortly. Thank you.